What's the difference between this photo and this photo? And what's the difference between this photo and this photo? The correct answer is everything. But mostly I'd say it's the focal length at which they were taken. It's the reason why you like this photo better than this photo, and why in this photo you're more interested in the foreground than in the background. And in this photo you don't even notice there's no foreground at all. It's time to demystify focal lengths. Welcome to the video. Focal lengths do a lot more to your image than just changing the field of view. In fact, by understanding focal lengths, you're one step further in mastering composition. In this video I'm going to explain to you how focal lengths work, and I'll not only stick to the technical characteristics of each focal length, but also how they work together with your composition. At the end of this video you should have a good idea of how you can use focal lengths to enhance your composition. Let's get started with wide-angle lenses. Wide-angle lenses give you a huge field of view, way wider than how we humans experience the world. They also come with a very large depth of field, which means that it's easy to get everything from front to back in focus. Take a look at this landscape photo, for example. You can see that the foreground and the mountains very far away are all in focus. Now, due to these characteristics, it's actually a preferred lens for many landscape photographers, because they can take the entire landscape in one photo and have everything in focus. Then let's talk about depth. Wide-angle lenses offer a huge amount of depth, which means they make objects look further apart than they actually are in real life. Again, take a look at this photo, for example. You can see the mountains in the background look super far away and insignificant, defeating the whole point of the photo. I wanted to give the viewers some kind of epic travel feelings, but everything looks kind of boring now. And that's the catch-22 of wide-angle lenses. Their wide field of view and huge depth of field help you get an entire landscape in the frame, but at the same time it makes interesting features look distant, small and insignificant, thus defeating the point of the photo. Another element of wide-angle lenses is their distortion. Objects close to the camera will look disproportionately big, while objects close to the edge of the frame will look stretched out, and sometimes straight lines are even curved due to the distortion. All of this means that wide-angle lenses are not a good choice for portrait photography, as your nose will look disproportionately big because it's closer to the camera, and your forehead will look stretched out. All these features kind of make wide-angle lenses hard to work with. However, if you use their depth, their distortion and their field of view to your advantage, you can get some really interesting compositions. For example, take a look at this photo that I shot during a bouldering competition last February. By positioning the hand of the climber close to the edge of the frame, I made it look like he has to stretch his arm extremely far. On top of that, the ground looks far away, adding to the drama of the moment. In my experience, wide-angle lenses shine best when you've got an interesting foreground element to work with. And when you point your camera slightly towards the ground, or keep it closer to the ground, you'll enhance this effect by making the foreground even bigger. In this photo I did both. You can see how distance gets distorted. The bushes in the middle ground are only about 2 meters away from the closest bushes, but they look much farther away. A more extreme example is this photo. The branches sticking out of the sand are only some 30 centimeters away from my camera. If you zoom in, you can make out individual grains of sand. These kind of compositions work best if you've got interesting shapes or patterns in the foreground, like in the photos with the dunes or in this one, where the dried ground and the leading lines guide your eyes towards a lonely tree in the distance. Another key element of wide-angle lenses is to simplify your composition. Because of their wide field of view, they'll often take in a lot of elements, and not every element will add to your composition. So trying to aim for a simple composition often works. Personally, if I find my composition is too busy, I try to reframe by just walking around, or maybe I'll use Photoshop or Lightroom to edit out some of the details I don't like. Then let's move on to the other side of the spectrum. Telephoto lenses, or longer focal lengths as they're also called. With the telephoto lens, your field of view is going to be extremely narrow, allowing you to pick up details from afar. And instead of depth, telephoto lenses offer compression. Compression means that objects that are normally very far apart suddenly look very close together on the photo, and objects that are very far away from the camera also look close by. You can use this effect to enhance the size of the landscape, making it look bigger. In this photo, the mountain towers over me, looking impressively tall. It gives you, the viewer, a feel for the massive scale of the landscape I was standing in front of. To enhance this effect even more, I focus on the mountain rather than myself. Had I used a wide-angle lens, the whole idea of the photo wouldn't have worked. Another key element of longer focal lengths is a lack of distortion. Where I just explained that wide-angle lenses have a lot of distortion, this is not the case for longer focal lengths. What longer focal lengths do have, however, is a naturally shallow depth of field. Now this can be extremely handy or a real pain in the ass, depending on what your goal is for the photo. In this photo, for example, I wanted to have the background out of focus. And with the longer focal length, that was very easy to achieve, and it worked. However, if I wanted everything to be in focus, it would have been very hard to achieve that with a telephoto lens. Because of the lack of distortion and the naturally shallow depth of field, lots of portrait photographers prefer to work with longer focal lengths, as the face will stay in proportion and the naturally shallow depth of field will allow separation from the subject from the background, which is generally what you want in portrait photography. So what do all of these traits mean for your telephoto compositions? Personally, I think telephoto lenses are extremely good for showing the scale of a landscape, like I've shown you in this photo, or isolating a subject with help of their narrow field of view and sometimes shallow depth of field. The narrow field of view helps me, for example, isolate that radar station, and it makes the background seem much bigger. The compression a telelens offers is also very helpful for putting together multiple layers which to the human eye seem quite far apart. Thus, interesting lines and layers are actually very important to your composition. Take a look at this photo, a shot in the fall in Austria. The mountain station, bottom middle, seems very close to the massive mountain range in the distance, even though the distance between the mountain station and the closest peak at the right edge of the range is 7 kilometers. The distance between the closest peak and the tall one center back is just shy of 11 kilometers. The broad, glaciered mountain on the right is a grand total of 26.5 kilometers away from the front end of my lens. Then, last but not least, with telephoto photography, your foreground becomes much less important. In fact, most of the photographs I've shown you shot with a telephoto lens don't even have a foreground at all. Also, before you start shooting with a telephoto lens, another important aspect of telephoto photography is stabilization. Because of the narrow field of view, any jitter made by your hands or your body is going to be extremely exaggerated, resulting in shaky video or blurry photos. This is why most telephoto lenses come with optical image stabilization, to make sure that the shot remains fairly stable. Still, this has its limits, and if you really want to have a stable shot, it's very often recommended to use a tripod that helps stabilize your camera for you. Then let's move on to the final category, standard focal lengths. Standard focal lengths hover somewhere in between telephoto photography and wide-angle photography, and they're similar to how the human eye works. Now, I have to say, obviously human eyesight is very differently from a camera, because when you're focusing on a very small task, you might focus on only a very small portion of your vision, but when you're in traffic, you focus on the broad gist of your vision, trying to take as much in as you can. This means that it's silly to determine one singular standard focal length and say this is how the human eye works and this is the standard focal length. Rather, the maximum human eyesight is around 220 degrees, but our central vision is only 5 degrees, with details dropping off very quickly after only 18 degrees. That being said, standard focal lengths offer everything from a fairly wide field of view to a fairly narrow field of view. There's no strict demarcation line. They're thus best described as being kind of in the middle. All of this means that they don't offer you the compression telephoto lenses give you, and they also don't give you the extremely large foregrounds and depth that wide-angle lenses give you. Their depth of field is also in the middle, not as shallow as with telephoto lenses, not as large as with wide-angle lenses. Distortion-wise, they don't give as much distortion as a wide-angle lens, but I would be careful positioning anything important too close to the edge of the frame or photographing a face from too close by, because then distortion will kick in. All of this might make standard focal lengths sound boring, but in reality they're very fun to shoot. They're a jack of all trades and most photographers love them for it. Personally, they're the lenses I use mostly in my daily life, whether I'm shooting street photography, a fun bouldering session, or when I'm working as a paid professional. I even sometimes use standard focal lengths to shoot landscapes. What I think standard focal lengths excel at is shooting people, whether it's shooting street photography, environmental portraits or events. I think it is because they so closely resemble how we humans experience the world, and they make it easy to connect to the photo emotionally. Whereas wide-angle lenses and telephoto lenses give awe-inspiring perspectives, I think the same perspectives kinda makes it harder for us to connect to these photos on a more emotional level. Personally, in terms of composition, I tend to use a shallow depth of field quite a lot with standard focal lengths. Especially when combined with an out of focus foreground element, this still adds a little bit of depth to your photo. On top of that, I take cues from both wide-angle photography and telephoto photography. In this landscape shot, for example, lines and layers play a huge role in the composition, just as with telephoto photography. And in this environmental portrait, I used a slight distortion of my lens to make my subject look a little bit more taller and powerful, as I didn't want her to come across as feeble, which is a standard stereotype used for the elderly. Now, that's a focal length covered. As you might have noticed, I refrained from telling you which focal length is what exactly. That has two reasons. Firstly, it's kind of subjective. There's no clear demarcation line where a wide-angle lens standard focal lengths begin, and the same goes for standard focal lengths and telephoto focal lengths. Secondly, your field of view and thus how wide your angle is going to be very much depends on sensor size. I work with a Fujifilm sensor that has a 1.5 times crop, which means that if you take a 50mm lens on it, it has the field of view of a 75mm lens on a full frame system. Personally, for my 1.5 crop system, I would say that anything above 23mm is considered standard focal length, anything below 23mm is considered to be wide-angle lens, and anything above 50mm I would say is telephoto lens. But like I said, that's just how I see it, and there's no clear demarcation line. So rather than giving you a clear example of each type of lens, I let you figure it out. What I hope you take away from this video is a clear, practical understanding of focal lengths and how they affect your composition and how you can work with certain focal lengths to enhance the composition you have in mind. Alright, that's it for this video. Now if this video was useful to you or if you liked it, please feel free to leave a like and consider subscribing to my channel. It would help me out tremendously, and it also took me a lot of time and effort to compile this video for you. If you've got any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments. I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible with a good answer. Also, I'm very curious to how you use your camera. What's your favorite focal length? How do you use it? You've got any tips I missed? For now though, have a great day, and remember, just go out and shoot.